Okay, in between Mars and Jupiter, you have the asteroid belt, which used to be a planet known as Maldek or Tiamat. It may have been the first planet that our iteration of humans came from. There are many other species of humans who are way older than us, but the one that we are, I believe, first came from Maldek or Tiamat. It was our home planet, quote-unquote. It was a mixed bag of a place. In some places it was very peaceful, spiritual, relaxed, all that. In other places it was a hub of what we today would call Satanism, or satanic ritual abuse, and violence and all of that. To this day, people are often transported back in time to that period to be sacrificed or to partake in rituals. I know that there were pyramids there, massive white pyramids that housed all sorts of technologies that we in Montauk would go in and raid. And eventually, in the Orion War, it was destroyed. And nowadays, it is essentially a giant hub of mining and organized crime and piracy. The asteroid belt is. A lot of the larger asteroids have havens for, gambling and cheap sex and all of that good stuff. Everyone needs some fun once in a while. And, but most of it is used for mining. It's quite dangerous to go through in a ship because there are pirates, and also because of the density of asteroids. It's very, very, very difficult to navigate unless you're going extremely slowly. So if you have to, for whatever reason, go across it, it will take you several days to get across it. Because you have to go so slowly, and also you'd better have good defenses, not only for collisions, but also because it's nearly impossible to do accurate radar of the asteroid belt, because all the rocks get in the way, so pirates and such can just hide anywhere. There are also some extremely wealthy parts, of course, stations floating on the outer reaches of it, or places on Ceres or Vesta, which are colonies populated by the extremely wealthy, such as, for example, the Ceres colony that Tony Rodriguez talked about. These are, like I said, very wealthy and are havens of expensive gambling and expensive sex. So yeah, that's what I would say about the asteroid belt. But most of it is mining.
Is there any information on the breakaway about Tiamat being the planet of origin of our human species?
Our human species, Solarans, yes. That's what's generally taught. That's what is generally supported in the archaeological record. However, it is not the origin of humans. Humans, the first humans, are from the Lyra constellation, and they were around many millions of years ago, long before anyone had ever settled or even discovered this solar system we live in.
And by our human species from Tiamat, you mean a cross between the Anunnaki and some poor hominid whose wife they turned into a widow?
Yeah, well, no, the reverse. They made the husband into a widower. They took a woman from this species and crossed it with an Anunnaki male. Likely Enki, at least that's the story that you'll hear, but I don't know whether I believe that. But yes, that is our human species, quote-unquote. At least that is RH positive ones. RH negatives are a whole other can of worms, but that's beyond the scope of this conversation.
Do we know what races lived on Tiamat primarily? Which specific races were more peaceful and which were engaged in the dark practices?
Alright, it was split relatively evenly between at least the two big ones, the Anunnaki and the Tiamat indigenous, who the species still exists. They look essentially like crested gecko humanoids, like fairly humanoid body. They have a tail and a head like a crested gecko, and they're usually yellow. Some of them are more reddish, some of them are more greenish. So split between them and the Anunnaki. The Tiamat indigenous, I would say they're more peaceful. I mean, they were quite hostile when, for example, Montauk people were going back in time and going to Tiamat and all that, but that's, I would be too, so That's to be expected. And we all know what the Anunnaki do. They are engaged in what you call dark practices. Okay, let's see. There were other races living there too. There was a small Draco contingent, not a big one at all, but it was there. There were mantids, imperial mantids from the Mantid Empire, and there were other not mantids, other insectoids. There were, they looked like stick bugs, essentially. They lived there. I believe they also may have been indigenous, but they never grew to large numbers at all. But they were there. And they were very friendly. In fact, they were probably too friendly because they let themselves be walked all over as a civilization. And yeah, and then we all know how that ended.
You said that the Anunnaki participate in dark rituals, but in the religion show, you said that they don't accept human sacrifice. So they didn't do sacrifice on Tiamat then?
Dark rituals does not just mean human sacrifice. They sacrifice other sentient species, including sometimes their own children. Some of the elite Anunnaki families do that. And they sacrifice Tiamat natives. And with humans, they may not sacrifice human people, but they do sex rituals with them. They do have breeding with them. So that's not a positive thing.
What is the official story about how Tiamat was destroyed? What are the influences of the Tiamat civilizations and technology that are present either on Earth or in the breakaway today?
It was during the Orion Wars, I would say probably about 50,000 years ago, or thereabouts, and the Draco were using it as their main forward operating base for this sector, and so the Lyrans attacked it. They pelted it with rocks. Penny has talked about how they do that, and yeah, it's a very effective system. They just dropped rocks on it until eventually the planet cracked and broke into pieces and became the asteroid belt that we all know and love today. What are the influences of the Tiamat civilizations and technology that are present either on Earth or in the breakaway today? I would say the big one is the glass pads. You know, everyone talks about the glass pads, everyone remembers the glass pads, everyone used the glass pads in all the factions, like everyone, right? Those came from Tiamat, actually. Yeah, by going, you know, usual thing, going back in time and finding stuff there and stealing it and reverse engineering it. And nowadays they usually get the diamonds to make the glass pads from the remains of Tiamat. So yeah, it's usually if you're holding a glass pad, you're holding a little piece of Tiamat, both literally and figuratively.
When did the asteroid mining start by the ICC?
Well, okay, the ICC, first of all, is not entirely a legitimate term. It's not in and of itself an organization. It's just a bunch of corporations who loosely associate with each other. But mining of the asteroid belts itself started in the 1940s, or maybe even late 1930s. It's been going on for quite a while. Corporate involvement began, I would say, in the 60s.
Who and how did the asteroid mining in the 1930s and 40s?
Germans, of course, and Japanese. But in that period, mostly Germans. How they did it back then, they had ships with huge drills attached, and they would be like using like a vortex device parked next to it to kind of suck in the things that the drill chipped off. It was very expensive and impractical and destructive, so they don't really do that anymore. They haven't done that in quite a long time, but that is how they started off doing it.
What are some of the companies that are engaged in the mining? Are the Chinese companies part of the ICC, i.e. not at odds with the West, over the real estate in the solar system?
One big one is Citgo, which is a petroleum corporation on Earth. Another one is CNPC, Chinese National Petroleum Corporation, which is obviously another petroleum corporation. Those petroleum companies both have secret branches of themselves that are asteroid mining. And another one is one that does not exist on Earth that is called KPMG, or KBMG, Kuiper Belt Mining Group. And in spite of the name, they do also mine in the asteroid belt that's closest to us, not just the Kuiper Belt. And they also mine outside entirely. And it is a Japanese company, actually run by a family by the name of Fujimori. There are other companies that I don't really remember the names of precisely. There's one that they use a giant yellow triangle as their symbol. Not the red triangle like Citgo. This is a giant yellow triangle on a black background. And I can't remember the name of that company, but that one is also very influential. I know that some jewelry companies, they may not run mines, but they do, they are involved in, they do benefit from the mining. Such as Seiko Watch Company, Zales Diamond Company, and there's another diamond company that only exists in the breakaway, and I don't remember the name of it, but it is a sub-branch of Kruger that that is involved in making and selling jewelry. And people who buy that don't even know that it is a Kruger sub-branch, but it is. And that's part of how they get their cash flow in, is by selling this expensive, exquisite jewelry to chumps, pretty much. Are the Chinese companies part of the ICC, i.e. not at odds with the West over the real estate? Yeah. Corporations are not like countries. Corporations are people, you know, rich assholes who combine in order to make themselves and each other richer because it's mutually beneficial, until they start impeding on each other's territory. But, you know, space is big enough that that doesn't usually happen. So, no, they're not at odds at all.
Do any of the mined materials end up on Earth? Or is it all for the development of the breakaway?
Well, the stuff to make glass pads sometimes ends up on Earth, yeah. That's been known to happen. And in fact, it kind of has to, because there is not enough diamond on Earth to make glass pads. There are a lot more diamonds on Earth than people think, but there is not enough to support the glass pad industry by any stretch. And, you know, everyone in every dumb here uses glass pads.
Are there new elements beyond our periodic table that can be found in space and would be useful?
There are a lot of different kinds of crystals in space that you would not find here, particularly the ones from, this is a whole other subject, but the ones from Epsilon Reticuli, which are orange crystals that are used a lot in starships. They last the longest of any crystal that has ever been found. So those are used for those crystal hyperspace drives that people like Matt Tracy have discussed. And those are not in our periodic table, I don't believe. There is also a silicon-like thing, but it's not exactly silicon, that is used quite a lot. I don't know whether it's better than silicon or not, but silicon as we find it here is actually extremely, extremely rare. There are only a few planets anywhere that have it, and it's a finite resource. So usually they use this other thing that is silicon-like, but is much more common. It just happens to not be found here.
How in demand are these mined materials with the ETs? Do any of the ETs buy out concessions from mining there? And who do they buy it from?
Yeah, they're in demand. These ETs were doing mining a lot, but you know, a lot of them are only too happy to make less work for themselves and let these human corporations with their slave labor do it. So, yeah, I would say actually probably most buyers are ETs. It's just we don't get to see very many of whatever they make with it because it's outside of, you know, our purview. Who do they buy it from? They buy it from the corporations who are doing the mining. Or they buy the products that are made from the mining. They buy the glass pads and things.
If the solar system is on paper owned by the Draco Empire and is sublet to the Anunnaki, do they tax all this economic activity conducted by the planetary corporations and the Germans?
Oh yes. They tax, usually the main currency is DNA. They really like DNA. They will take DNA samples to go and, make their super soldiers and their abominations and what have you. And they'll also take a cut of the, what do you call it? The yield of whatever gets mined. They do get a cut of that automatically. That is their cut and is non-negotiable. So yeah, there is taxation, definitely.
Is the asteroid belt formally under some singular authority or multiple authorities? For instance, do the Germans lease Ceres from the Draco or someone else? Or do they formally own it without paying the lease fees?
In theory, everything is leased from the Draco, except for Vesta. Vesta is owned outright by the Germans. They have purchased it completely, and it is entirely their sovereign territory. And it's also the only, kind of stable-ish place in the belt. The rest is a Wild West. Free-for-all, just, insanity. People are constantly murdering each other. It's, it's not a good time, to say the least.
How do different groups take over specific areas in the belt and manage to keep it? Have there been any major conflicts over the resources in the solar system?
All the time. There is, I mentioned it in the last thing, there is constant fighting. There are frequent slave revolts that go nowhere. And there are these companies who are fighting other people who might want in, such as, well, lots of different ET groups. So it is a very bloody process to keep a hold of all this. It's not at all easy, but it is profitable, so they keep at it.
How prevalent is slave labor in the mining industry? Are there many 20 and back type slaves in these worker colonies?
Slave labor is the backbone of the asteroid mining industry. Basically all of the actual work is done by slaves. Are there many 20 and back type slaves in these worker colonies? I rather doubt it. I think these are people these are like born colonials who have been enslaved and were born to other slaves, essentially. That's what I think.
Which ET groups are the most notorious for the pirate activities in those parts?
That would be the Colonies, and I will have to give credit to this individual for actually telling me the name of this species, because I would not have known the name of this species, Tomas Alvin. He did tell me the name of this species. But these are lizard people that are about 4 feet tall. They have long prehensile tails. They're usually a light green color. Some of them are a light brown. There's a few that are actually a really deep dark red color. Those are very rare. And they walk on their back legs, but at high speed they will get down on all fours to move. And they are notorious for piracy. And so we often actually use their services also as pirates. They're spread throughout the galaxy by now. So everywhere that there's scrapping to be done, you'll find someone who's hired a ship full of those guys to do it, because they're experts at stripping things down and cannibalizing them for parts and all of that. Now there are also Aldebaranite pirates, not in as large numbers, but there are Aldebaranite pirates, and they're quite nasty, and generally if you see an Aldebaranite pirate ship heading towards you, you're not supposed to engage. You're supposed to, if you can jump out immediately, do, and if you can't, you let them come and take your stuff, because you're not going to win in a fight against them.
Are there human pirates as well? And if yes, have they no honor?
Yeah, there are human pirates. Plenty of them. That's not at all an uncommon thing that you'll hear about, that another ship full of Solarans took your yield of diamonds or whatever. That's a pretty normal thing. And have they no honor? I'm gonna say that most of them do not. I'm sure some of them do. There are some who really are Robin Hood types. That's very rare, but it does exist. So those guys, I would say, have some degree of honor, but most of them do not.
What are the protocols for encountering pirates?
The protocol is usually fire and defend your bounty at all costs, or your yield. It's not a bounty. Your yield of whatever it is you've just mined, or whatever someone else has just mined and you picked it up. You defend that at all costs and get back to the delivery point as soon as possible. Unless, like I mentioned, it's Aldebaranite pirates. If your ship has warp capabilities or portaling capabilities, use that to get out immediately. If your ship does not, which a great many ships in the belt don't, then you pretty much have no choice but to let them come and steal your stuff. Because otherwise, yeah, if you get in a fight with them, it's not going to end well.
And wait, isn't our solar wardens supposed to guard the system against those troublemakers at all times?
Most of the time they're paid off and they are in league with the troublemakers. Solar Warden's purpose is not to protect anything. Solar Warden's purpose is to drag World War II into space, as Penny has said before. Now, you can make your arguments as to whether or not that might be kind of a good pursuit, but the fact remains that is what they're there for. Their protection of such as it is, which is not much, is a byproduct of that. So yeah.
Do you know the main purpose of the series Colony as a whole? And what are its main industries?
Its purpose and industry are to be essentially a free-for-all, adults-only playground. That is, there's very few laws. They enforce laws against having child prostitutes, but that's pretty much the only thing that's really enforced there. And so yeah, its main industries are things around that. Prostitution, gambling, extreme like adventure sports and like adventure tourism. Those are its main industries. And also there's amusement parks and stuff there too, interestingly.
Do you know the origin of the tall humanoid race that ran various businesses on Ceres?
No. Educated guess, probably tall whites, actually. Or they were actually human, or Solarian humans, but they were enhanced and had maybe been hybridized somewhat in order to adapt to the lower gravity, and so they wound up being, you know, really tall. Those would be my best guesses, but I don't know for sure.
What are some other prominent colonies and bases in the belt?
The other big one that I know of is Vesta. Vesta has mostly been hollowed out. It was hollowed out probably like thousands of years ago, and is now a completely sovereign German area. And it's very regimented and very political, I guess. It's where a lot of the politics of what happens in the solar system are dictated. You know, normal German citizens oftentimes don't even know that it exists because they're not really supposed to know anything about their politics. I've only been there once, and it was only like picking someone up briefly, but she wound up telling me quite a bit about it, that I have spotty memories of what she told me. But I remember what it looked like, and it was all built around the inside of this asteroid, looking towards the center. There was gravity plating so that it was, you were walking around looking towards the center. And it had like really huge white buildings. I don't think that the Germans actually built this stuff themselves. I think this was already there when they moved in or when it was given to them. Alright, that's what I can think of.
How cheap is cheap sex anyway, and how expensive does it get?
Cheap sex is very cheap, like 50 cents a minute, or the equivalent in that currency. So like, if you're with a prostitute, you're probably not going to be spending more than 30 minutes, right? So like $15? Yeah, that's very cheap. How expensive does it get? It goes, I don't know the upper limit prices, but it can go up to like thousands of dollars or the equivalent of thousands of dollars per hour, because there are ET prostitutes who can do things that no one else can do. I'm not going to get too graphic on that because like I don't want my channel to become age restricted, but I think you get the gist of what I'm saying.
Can one pay with the greenbacks, or do you need the space Deutsche Marks on you everywhere? What's the main currency in those parts? Are there Earth currency exchange stalls?
Yes, but the exchange rate is not favorable, really, and if you pay with your currency just outright of your country, it's going to end up costing you considerably more. But yeah, you can pay with American dollars, you can pay with euros, you can pay with British pounds, you can pay with Russian rubles, you can pay with Japanese yen, you know, the main ones.
Is there alien prostitution? And if yes, what races are popular among the human xenophiles?
There's a kind of mantid. It's not quite the imperial mantids. These are a light brown color. And they're very popular. Yeah, those are popular, and I will neither confirm nor deny that I have made use of their services. I paid generously. I was very accommodating. I did not ask for anything that was not on the table, and all of that. I was a good client, and I tipped very generously. Those are popular. You'll also find a lot of like human variation species they're less valuable on the slave market than Solarian humans are. You'll find a lot of like Alterans, for instance. They look like us, but they have turquoise skin. Their DNA is less valuable on the market, and so they make cheap labor in places. And there are reptilian prostitutes, not Draco, at least not for us. There are probably, I imagine, the Dracos living there have their own entire thing going, but there are reptilian prostitutes of different species.
What attracts alien clients and the human sex workers? I mean, really.
Well, I mean, I think human ladies are very good at that sort of thing. A lot of ETs, definitely not all of them by any means, but a lot of ET women are very robotic sexually, whereas like human prostitutes will be enthusiastic, or at least they'll pretend to be for their clients, and so that a lot of ETs like that.
Did I hear it right that you FCUK'd a BUG? Can you share your emotions? Or rather, what the hell were you thinking?
My emotions about the experience, to be honest, I wasn't that into it. It was kind of a social pressure thing where it was like everyone else was doing it, and so it was like, alright, I guess I'll give it a go. And so it wasn't terrible or anything, but it wasn't great. I wouldn't go out of my way to do it again.
Who are the biggest owners of the gambling industry? And do the Chinese gamble out there as much as they do here, i.e., like there is no tomorrow?
Gambling is run by ETs. I don't know of any specific species that owns gambling joints in numbers more than others. I've never really gone to those sorts of places, at least that I remember. That's not my idea of a good night out, to be quite honest. And do the Chinese gamble out there as much as they do here, i.e. like there is no tomorrow? Yeah, of course they do. You know, it's part of the culture. You gamble over everything. They might not necessarily always be gambling with money, although they do that plenty too, but they gamble with whatever they have, with diamonds or with DNA samples that can then be sold off to someone, you know, whatever they've got on hand. Yeah, they gamble. Plenty.
And lastly, if I don't gamble and am happily married, would I be able to find a place in the belt to contemplate the beauty of space and our fleeting existence? Are there ashrams and meditation centers there with a good view?
No. Just to put it simply, no. The belt is not the place for you if you want a peaceful existence. It is a frenetic hell zone. A frenetic, icy hell zone. Yeah, you're not gonna have a good time unless you're very rich and all of that. So yeah, that's what I'm gonna say about that. Most people practice a muted asatru. They're not hyper-religious. They don't go around, preaching or whatever the fuck. But they do have, like, little altars in their homes, and they do, on holidays, do their thing. That's the majority. There are little communities here and there, and I'm talking mostly about German colonies, because that's what I know the most about. My understanding is that American colonies are pretty diverse. I did have an altar who lived for several years in a Russian colony, and there was an active Russian Orthodox church there, and there were actually even several of the locals, the native population of the planet, who had been baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church. So it varies, but in general it's a muted asatru. When you get into the military and into the really, really upper echelons of society, there's Schwarze Sonne, which is a dark asatru, I guess, where they drink black goo and all that. And the practices do vary by colony, of course, such as on New Atlantis they do orgies. It's all with consenting adults, so it's not like, really terribly fucked up or anything. It's just, they do that in order to bring forward their ancestors. And apparently it works. I mean, somebody comes when they're doing that. Someone shows up every time, or so I'm told. I don't remember ever participating, but apparently someone does show up. So, to them, I guess it's worth it. I would think it would be insanely awkward if you're, like, getting it on with all your friends and your grandmother shows up, but to each their own. Okay, yeah.
What are the main tenets of the asatru religion? What are some of the must-dos and taboos? When are their festivals and how are they celebrated?
The main tenets are that it is a form of ancestor worship. They worship the Norse gods as their ET ancestors. They do not worship them as gods in the way that we would think of them. They don't strictly believe in divinity or a god at all, like how most people would think of it. They're not atheist, but they're also not atheist, if that makes any sense. So they view it as honoring and worshipping their ancestors, striving to live like them as much as they can, because they see the past, that era, as utopian, and it gets them a lot of favors, or at least they think it does, so they consider that worth it. What are some of the must-dos and taboos? That varies enormously from planet to planet. The general must-dos are maintaining some level of genetic purity, as well as, in general, not always, but usually, refraining completely and totally from using cybernetics, although there are tons of people who break that all the time, especially within the military, but, like, it's viewed as a major taboo, and you have to have a decent character, at least in public. Don't be being drunk in public, that sort of thing. Don't be a drug addict. Don't be gay if you can help it, which, by the way, I don't agree with, but that's how they think of it. And, don't be a pedophile. Otherwise, they let you do pretty much whatever you want. It's not one of those religions where you're not allowed to participate in, like, interfaith activities or things like that. They don't care about that. They'll let you, marry whoever you want. You can sleep with whoever you want, pretty much, that sort of thing. Oh, when are their festivals and how are they celebrated? That varies again by planet. They celebrate their festivals during major celestial events. Eclipses, particularly, changes of orbit, if that's a thing in whatever solar system they're in, that sort of thing. And how they're celebrated varies again. But usually it involves a lot of drinking and you're encouraged to, like, get laid that night, drink a lot, and, be joyful to the gods, or be joyful to your ancestors, and all of that. So that's, a very, very Norse type of thing. That's how they generally celebrate. Sometimes it depends on the culture and what the main industry is on the planet. For instance, like in agricultural planets, they'll often have, like, also have like really grand feasts, and they'll have like all the chefs come out and compete to make like the most elaborate and fabulous dishes, and they'll give part of it as an offering, and they'll eat the rest and have a grand feast. If it's a really snowy planet, they might celebrate by like going out and like hunting for new furs or things like that, or by showing off their new furs. That I remember that sort of thing. So it all varies quite a bit planet to planet.
Do they still worship or communicate with the Vanir, Valkyries, elves, and dwarves?
Not really elves and dwarves, because those guys aren't really different from the rest of us, so they don't worship them or communicate with them. The Vanir and the Valkyries, yes, absolutely, they do that to a huge extent, because, you know, the Vanir are fertility related, and fertility is kind of the biggest tenet of their entire civilization, is, you know, breeding and producing more and more babies to grow the empire more. And the Valkyries, yes, because particularly the military guys, yes, because they all want to go to Valhalla. So that's, yeah, they still do that.
Did they ever find out who Odin, Thor, Loki, and the other old gods really were or are? Do they contact them in this realm or another?
Yeah, they're the Anunnaki in nearly all cases. One exception is Odin's mother. In all likelihood, I mean, of course, these are all really ancient records that have been passed down and, you know, fairy tale-ized over the years, so there's, you know, you're never going to know fully everything. But in all likelihood, Odin's mother, the woman they have is Odin's mother in the Eddas, was actually one of his stepmothers, because Odin's real mother, Odin is Enki, his real mother was a Draco princess, so the ice giant, quote-unquote, was one of his stepmothers, who was an ancient builder race, one of the last remaining ones in that period, woman who, and the ancient builder race, for people who don't know, they looked just like us, but they were 30 feet tall. So she was one of those, and I guess since she was recorded as an ice giant, she probably came from a really cold planet. Do they contact them in this realm or another? Yes, they do. They contact them through divination and oracles. They do have to keep it somewhat religiousified, I guess, so they don't just use their regular telepath. They have someone who gets high and contacts them, because I guess people like that more. I guess it has more of a religious-y spectacle to it, so, you know, it's the same old story, really, of, like, making something more complicated and religiousified than it needs to be. But yeah, they contact them. Who is their main god figure now? It's still pretty much Odin. I mean, who else gets venerated varies from planet to planet. A lot of civilians in particular venerate Hel, particularly civilian women venerate Hel quite a lot, whereas military guys, more often than not, venerate Odin and Freya, and Thor also, because they all want to go to Valhalla and be like, you know, big tough guys in the here and now, you know, that sort of thing.
What are the tenets of the Schwarze Sonne? Why is drinking black goo and sacrificing animals and people a necessary practice for them? Do they actually have a scientific understanding of the black goo?
They don't exactly have tenets. They're not exactly a religion. They're a lifestyle choice. You know, they're like people who decide to dress a certain way and move out into the woods and take mushrooms all day. They're not worshipping anything, and they don't really have a moral code associated with them. It's just a method of living your life. But why is drinking black goo and sacrificing animals and people a necessary practice for them? Because that's how they get to their ascended level, what they view as an ascended level, where they have extremely high IQs, they are not bound to emotion, they're in perfect health all the time, and they age very slowly. You know, doing those sorts of things, drinking black goo and sacrificing animals and people and eating them. They have to eat them too and drink their blood. That's a big part of it. You know, if you do those things, you will achieve quite a lot in life. I'm most certainly not promoting those things, but you will achieve a lot in life if you do those things. Do they actually have a scientific understanding of the black goo? Yeah, completely. They know what it is. They've studied it in labs. They know that it's nanobots, that they're essentially single-celled organisms that proliferate and reproduce themselves at a constant rate. That there is a certain type of rock, I don't remember what kind of rock it is, but the black goo cling to the rock and they cannot become unclung unless the rock is heated to a certain temperature, and then the black goo flows out of it again. So, and I don't know quite what causes that. I guess it's some sort of chemical reaction that causes that to happen.
Is the Black Cube AI worship practiced by the elites there?
No. That is a Zeta Reticulan phenomenon that spread to some degree into Islam. It is not a part of Shvartasona religion. It is, again, the Shvartasona religion is not really even a religion. They don't worship anything. They don't believe in God. Most of them are militant atheists. It's just a way to get ahead in life for them. And they've culturized it so that they rope in some of these old quote-unquote gods. Sometimes. Martian Shvartasona, for example, does that. However, for instance, Vega Prime Shvartasona does not do that. They are completely disconnected from anything religious.
Is Vril still their religious order? What do they do?
Yes, it is still a religious order. I think I mentioned earlier in the education episode that there are systems in place, very strict systems in place in the schooling system of the breakaway, to where they have to keep an eye out for the slightest sign of a child being psychic, and also all children pretty much are subjected to tests at an early age to see if they might be psychic. So psychic girls have to they have to either join the military or join the Vril. Legally. It's a legal requirement. And so Vril women, Vril girls in the breakaway, they serve as oracles for their colonies or for their neighborhoods and so forth. They have to, learn how to handle certain drugs that they take, and they have to learn how to, they have to dress a certain way, they have to learn certain languages and things like that. And so they do that to serve as oracles, and you go and you hire them and they give you advice on this or that. Or they will divine your future and all sorts of things. All the things you would have found people doing with, for example, the ancient Greeks used to do with oracles, what some Chinese people still do with fortune tellers. That's what they do.
I know that you know a Vril priestess who's a celebrity on Earth. Any interesting story connected with her?
Her name on Earth is Rachel Weisz. She was in probably her best known movie was the Mummy movies in the late 90s, early 2000s. My alter Heinrich was looking for an arms dealer who had gone into hiding on this colony. He knew that this guy would probably be hanging out with one of a set of families who were in this colony, and he knew that this particular oracle lady was the one that all these families used, and that they would have told her a secret, such as that they were hiding an arms dealer in their attic. And so Heinrich went to her and he interrogated her, and she caved pretty quickly, because the way that society works is if someone in the military asks you for something, you have to do it right then and there. And the more you resist, the worse your punishment is going to be. So she didn't resist too much. She still got a light prison sentence of several years for resisting at all. That's how that society functions. So, yeah, that was that story. I don't remember the people's names or anything like that, but yeah, that's the story connected with her.
You said that you found some German artists of the past whose works point to them knowing something. Can you describe a couple of works and what is so special about them?
The two that come to mind the most are Fidus, F-I-D-U-S, and also Ludwig Fahrenkrog. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Fahrenkrog, he painted a number of images of, like, quote-unquote gods talking to man, and people out in the woods talking to the quote-unquote gods and their ancestors. He was of the Volkish tradition. In fact, he was one of the founders of the Volkish tradition. Very strong Nazi ties and all that. And he also painted several images that I recognize as being off-planet scenes. Which brings us to Fidus, the other one, who painted what I know for a fact are off-planet scenes. He painted one of the main temples in one of the colonies of Centurion. I'm certain he was a time traveler. Fidus, absolutely. I'm certain he was a time traveler. And he also painted images of like human animal chimeras, and one image that is very clearly some type of alien person. So yeah, those guys, and they were both founders or very influential upon the Volkisch movement, as I mentioned a minute ago, which was the precursor to the Nazi movement for all intents and purposes. And their works are still fairly commonly seen being spread around by like neo-Nazi groups and stuff today. Which, by the way, they were not Nazis during their lifetimes at all. They were actually very progressive in their day, but, you know, Nazis will co-opt anything if it makes them look good, and their art does look incredible. They were extremely talented people, especially Fidus, and his work is one of those things where it's like, it almost seems like he had to have been doing that for thousands of years in order to get that good, which is a big part of why I think that he was a time traveler, and also based on the fact that he painted certain images, such as the Centurion Temple, that did not exist until after his lifetime supposedly ended.
What are the religious practices of the breakaway Japanese? Did they ever find out who were some of their old gods? Who are their ET ancestors?
Basically, they practice usually Moloch worship intermingled with Shintoism, usually just more or less just in aesthetic ways. Like their Moloch temples, they look like Shinto temples, and things like, and they do some Shinto prayers and things like that, because I do have memories of several of the Arasaka kids doing Shinto prayers at times. So yeah, I remember that, and my Harune Arasaka, the one who was in my life so much, who will be in the book quite heavily, is he referred to himself as a lapsed Shinto. So that Shintoism is still relevant, but it's really Moloch worship. And Moloch is another ET. He is from the Taurus constellation, and he is a minotaur. Body roughly like that of a man, the head of a bull, furry. They usually have tails. Some of them have hooves, but most of them do not. Moloch does have hooves. That's considered it's a status symbol in their society for whatever reason. And the worship of him involves, again, like, you know, sacrificing people, drinking their blood, that sort of thing. And that summons Moloch, and he will do favors for you, either through just his psionic capabilities or through his connections. He'll do things that seem miraculous, because, of course, he also has ET technology, and as insanely advanced as SSP technology is, it's still nothing compared to what the ETs actually have and use for themselves. So the stuff they give us that becomes SSP technology is like children's toys. It's nothing to them. What they have is stuff that I don't even have the language to describe how advanced it can be. So, did they ever find out who were some of their old gods? I imagine they would have looked into that. I don't know that much about that, to be perfectly honest, but I'm sure that they would have. And who are their ET ancestors? Their ET ancestors, well, at the beginning, all Terran humans looked pretty much the same. They all looked roughly like Persian, Arab, North Indian, until someone decided after creating them, oh wait, there's no way to tell who owns these people, let's give them different skin colors. And eventually, further along the line, some horny Rigelians came along and started interbreeding with Terran human women, and that created the East Asiatic peoples. And what Rigelians are, they look roughly like an East Asian person. Probably the closest would be Japanese, if you were to really get hyper-specific, or possibly like far eastern part of China, southeastern China, or Japan would be the closest ethnic groups that they look like. They're about 4 feet tall. Yeah, they showed up and were basically interbreeding with the women of, and I'm sure some of the human men also took Rigelian wives. I have no doubt that happened. And what came out eventually was the East Asian people that we know and love today.
Has the esoteric been demystified in the breakaway? I.e., do they know about different realms of existence and the beings in them? And things like death, reincarnation, etc. are not an enigma to them anymore?
Absolutely, yes. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you notice, first of all, when you acknowledge that religion is bullshit, and then after that, when you have the correct technology and outside help and outside knowledge to be able to really investigate these things. They acknowledge and they know they have an understanding of the soul, a scientific understanding of the soul, which I explained in the Arts and Education episode earlier in this series. They know about different realms of existence because, for one thing, their ships enter them. When their ships go into quote-unquote hyperspace, that's the fifth dimension that they're entering, which is the afterlife area. That's where Valhalla and all of these other places are located that they want to get to so badly. And yeah, they know about the beings in them because, again, they go through them every time that they travel more than a few light years. They go into this other dimension, or density rather, and things like death, reincarnation, etc. are not an enigma to them anymore. Yeah, again, because they know where the afterlife is, and they also know that the soul can also just go to a different body if it wants to, and that's not a problem, and it often does. And there are actually little micro-religions or micro-sects in certain colonies where they don't actually plan to go to Valhalla or to Niflheim or these places, where they actually do specifically want to, like, kite their life path so that they can reincarnate in another body, either in another human body and continue their own cycle, or in an alien body of an alien species that they venerate. Those are not common or really all that socially acceptable religious things, but they do exist. You know, I guess humans have a tendency to create little cults everywhere we go.
You mentioned the Germans wanting to go to Valhalla. What is their modern understanding of it?
Valhalla is a little, it's a pocket land in the fifth dimension, or the afterlife, which, by the way, is... This is further proof that the whole New Age thing is a CIA psyop and part of the depopulation agenda, because to get to the fifth dimension you have to die. You can't just go there normally. You have to either get... Well, no, you can't stay there when you go by ship, actually. You have to, the ship will have to come out eventually with the physical things intact. So, you have to die to get there. So yeah, that's an important note to put in.
If the Germans know that their old gods are really ETs, why do they still worship them as gods? And do the Anunnaki get something from it?
Well, like I've mentioned before, they don't worship them as gods at all. They worship them as their ancestors, which is quite a different thing. It is still worship, but it is on a much more even footing than as a creator entity, you know. Do the Anunnaki get something from it? Yeah, they get, well, they get a big ego boost, and they also, usually a lot of the deals made are for personnel. So they get German personnel to go do their bidding and everything, or to be sometimes their sex slaves, which they need a lot of. Particularly, they need male sex slaves because nearly all of their men are sterile. So they take a lot of human men as sex slaves.
Did the Anunnaki ever show up and try to reclaim their divinity with the Germans directly? Do they require blood sacrifice too?
I imagine they would have, knowing what they're like, but they did not succeed. I'm sure there are still some pockets and, like, cults who do think they are actually gods, but, like, that would be very much a fringe, not accepted opinion, and it's just not borne out when you know what ETs are like and what they're capable of, and then you see and talk to an Anunnaki, you know very well that that's not a god. You know that that's basically you, but smarter. That's all that they really are. Oh, and do they require blood sacrifice too? No, they do not. The worship, they usually require either food offerings or sex rituals. That's it. They would not accept a blood sacrifice. They would say that that was, like, barbaric and disgusting to them.
If Enki's mom is a Draco princess, does he have reptilian features?
Actually, no. Strangely enough, I suppose they probably did some genetic engineering, so he wouldn't, because he would not have been accepted as king by the rest of the Anunnaki if he didn't look the same as them.
How did the Japanese end up worshipping Moloch of all things? Did he have a following in ancient Japan or somehow lured them into it later?
I don't know if he had a following in ancient Japan. The elites of Japan had been following that religion for a very long time, at least long enough that they were well into it by the time they got invited off-world. So I couldn't tell you the ins and outs of how it came to be.
Do any of the mystic groups of the breakaway have an updated understanding of what God consciousness might be and how to connect with it?
I believe some of them do. They, at least to an extent, I imagine it involves using a lot of drugs, for one thing, but I think some of them have had success with it, but again, they're so stigmatized that people don't really ask them questions that much.
Are the esoteric practices like astrology, palm reading, etc. still practiced by the breakaway society? Do they have more updated versions of them?
They still do astrology. Of course, you know, every planet has different configurations of stars that are visible from it and different, you know, everything. So it's, the astrology of every colony is different. But yeah, they still do astrology. They would not do palm reading because that would be viewed as like a gypsy practice and be looked down upon quite heavily. At least I imagine. It's possible that some people might do it, but I don't have any memories of ever encountering it. Do they have more updated versions of them? I guess they scientify it more. They've worked out why it is that astrology works. I don't know exactly why it works either, but a lot of times it does. Like, you know, if you've ever done your birth chart, you'd probably find it was pretty accurate. So, they've figured out what the scientific reasoning for that is. I don't know what it is exactly myself, but they do.
Which ETs are known to provide the best esoteric services? Has your alter Heinrich ever used them?
To a large degree, Mintaka and Orion groups. They kind of look like dark elves. They're more of a dark green than like a dark gray. Yeah, they're dark green elfish people, about between 9 and 14 feet tall, usually. They're known for their esoteric services. Has my alter Heinrich ever used them? For diplomatic purposes, yeah. Like, there are some cultures that are really dependent on, like, you know, religion, and they'll respect you a lot more if you partake in their religious practices, even if it's just once. He doesn't take any of it seriously, particularly. He's actually kind of a militant atheist, if anything. But, you know, he'll do what he has to do for his job.
If some groups in space practiced Christianity, did they ever find out more about Jesus' story? Or maybe know if he was fathered by an ET?
Yes, this is an interesting one, and I may be the first person to ever tell this publicly. Because this is taught in Shula, even in a decidedly, you know, non-Christian colony, such as the one that Heinrich went to. They still teach it because it's such a huge part of history. According to them, according to their... Probably they sent time travelers back to observe it, would be my guess, so that they would have an accurate story. According to them, Jesus was actually from Aldebaran. He was, for some reason, possibly because he was going to have brown hair, but no one is certain. It was known that he would not survive long in Aldebaran. It also may have been because of political ramifications, but no one knows for certain why. But, so as an embryo, he was brought to Earth and placed in Mary's womb. Mary probably was not her real name, of course. You know, they were writing a politically upheaving book. The folks who wrote the Bible were writing a politically upsetting book. So I imagine that they used fake names. But it is also known that he did not actually die, that his supposed death was a ritual, and that he then went to what is now France with Mary Magdalene and had the children who became the Merovingian kings and queens, and their children and everyone became the royalty all across Europe. So I think that's about it. I can say there is a book people can read about his life in France. It's called The Templar Revelation, Guardians of the Secret Identity of Christ by Lynn Pickett. Wonderful, wonderful book. People should read that. Can't link in the description to a free PDF, unfortunately, but if you look online, you will find the PDF of it.
Is it generally known in the programs which ET groups are pulling the strings of the organized religion on Earth? Can you name a couple of examples?
Nothing about Earth is generally known because they all think that Earth was destroyed, but the higher-ups and people in the intelligence field do know, at least to a degree. The Vatican is run essentially by the Orion Syndicate, Draco. Not the Draco Empire, the Orion Syndicate Draco are who run the Vatican. Let's see. Islam is too, diverse and weird to nail who exactly is running it, although they say that Allah was likely Enlil. It even sounds kind of similar, you'll notice. So, from its earliest origins was probably Enlil, and, Muhammad was a puppet of Enlil, but there are too many different versions of Islam and ways of practicing it that it's just kind of its own thing. Hinduism is run sort of by Enki. Again, there are things that have been inserted over the years that he does not particularly approve of or intend. He did not intend vegetarianism to become such a thing. He is not a vegetarian, and some of the weird shit like the widow sacrifice and the extreme obsession with chastity, even though they also have the Kama Sutra, but they're still kind of obsessed with chastity. He did not intend those things, but it originates from him. And by the way, Enki is Shiva, or Shiva is Enki. Yeah, I think that's good.
What are some of the interesting religious practices of the ET societies that stand out? Can humans convert to them if they wish?
It depends on which one. Again, there's no one-way answer to that question, but what are some practices that stand out? I remember one ocean planet where you had to go on basically a ceremonial hunt. You had to find this certain kind of creature, and you had to hunt one, and you had to use this kind of spear that was made out of a pink crystal and bring it home and cook it in a certain way and stuff. It's kind of a fuzzy memory, but I remember doing something like that, or seeing and hearing about doing something like that, I should say. I did not convert to their religion, but I knew those were the practices. Some Pleiadian religions do ceremonial orgies. Yeah, that's a thing, and actually that's fairly common. Alright, those are the ones that really stick out. I don't believe Solarans are allowed to convert to the one on the ocean planet. It's a fish people who live there, they're trout-like. I don't believe you're allowed to convert to that one. You are allowed to convert to Pleiadian religions.
And lastly, suppose someone wants to go to Valhalla after death and enjoy their 10,000 Norse virgins. Can one go without becoming a damn Nazi? What are the official requirements? This is for a friend, not myself.
No, you don't have to be a Nazi. You do have to be a Norse pagan, and you also have to have died in battle. Yeah, that's your requirements, pretty much. I don't think you're making it, sorry. And I don't think your friend is going to make it either, but, maybe your friend is desperate. Alright, past the asteroid belt, you have Jupiter and her moons. I'll start with Jupiter herself. Jupiter is basically just a hub for floating colonies in the atmosphere. They're all covered up, of course, because the atmosphere is not breathable in the slightest. The giant red spot on Jupiter is a wormhole, a massive and very important wormhole that can be taken all over the place, and which is basically the second biggest transit point into and out of the solar system outside of the sun. It's monitored and policed from Europa, which I will talk about next. Europa is a transit hub, again, run by, in this case, Solar Warden, from a base, I think near the equator on the side which faces Jupiter. The living is underground, but the transit spot is up kind of on the surface, although it's within a cave, a mass or a carved out area. It's not a natural cave, it's a spot that was carved out. It's where ships coming and going have to be inspected, and passenger manifests taken down, licensing verified. My Alter Atom did this for 50 years between 1969 and 2019. Yeah, so I have plenty of memories of Europa, but it was very boring, actually. Very boring. It was basically just, hello, sir, you need to go land over there and let my people come in and inspect your ship. Come to my office at, which is at such and such spot, so we can go over your paperwork and then we'll send you on your way. Imagine that for 50 years. So, yeah, that was, not fun, but that happened. There is also a huge ICC base underneath the water in Europa, on Europa, because Europa, of course, has a huge ocean. It has a crust of ice and then an ocean, and at the bottom of the ocean, somewhere there is an ICC base, or it used to be, I don't know who built it originally, but it was not them. It was built out of a glowing blue crystal of some sort. It's really, really impressive. And the native Europans, well, there are a fair amount of fish. The sentient native Europans are eels, except instead of front fins, they actually have arms that are similar to ours. The eels, they're about 100 feet long, and they glow in the dark. They're blue, glow in the dark. Beautiful. And they have about a Stone Age level civilization, so they don't really build much, but they are perfectly intelligent and sentient. That's about what I would say about Europa.
By the colonies floating in the atmosphere, you mean space stations? Why have a colony there and not on solid surface somewhere? Why is Jupiter's location so important?
Well, those colonies that are floating there are mining, essentially. They are mining from the atmosphere. And what they're mining is naturally occurring heavy water. It's a key element in starship fuel, and finding it naturally occurring is very rare. So that's why they do that. Why is Jupiter's location so important? Well, partly because of the heavy water I mentioned, and partly because of the giant wormhole, which is in the middle of the red spot, which is the largest wormhole in this solar system, and probably this quadrant, actually. It's quite important. It goes to all over the place.
Is this wormhole a doorway to hyperspace, from which you can go anywhere, or there is only a number of corridors you can take to a fixed number of places?
The second option, but there's so many. There's probably a couple thousand corridors. Some of them close and are replaced depending on the orbiting of the wormhole, or well, where it's positioned on the planet, and the planet is itself spinning and orbiting, you know, how that works. Some of them are permanently open at all times, but some of them close, but whenever one closes, it's replaced by another. So it's hugely important.
Who gave Solar Warden the authority to police and monitor the wormhole? Do they share it with anyone else, jurisdiction-wise?
The Anunnaki gave them that permission, and I suppose the Anunnaki themselves would have had to get it signed off by the Draco probably, but like has been mentioned before, the Draco don't really care about this sector, even though they themselves use that wormhole quite heavily, but still they're not particularly bothered. Do they share it with anyone else jurisdiction-wise? Well, it's really Anunnaki territory through and through, but like they're the only ones really doing anything there because you know, there's so few Anunnaki, their military is so small that they have to outsource everything, and for this they've pretty much exclusively outsourced to Solar Warden.
How big is the military contingent and their battle group there?
Well, it varies depending on the busyness of the wormhole. You know, the busyness varies by season. Sometimes a lot of the corridors that it leads to are to places that basically no one lives or that are not really fully discovered yet. And so when that, in those times, then the battle group is around, probably around 7,000. In the busy season, it goes up to around anywhere from 50 to 100,000. So it varies quite massively. The permanent base that monitors it, which we'll get to in a minute, is only around 2,500 people, permanent staff. A lot of more come and go, but yeah, okay.
What is the purpose of that ICC base in the ocean of Europa, and how big is it?
Its purpose, I believe, was research and development on like chimeras and stuff. I don't know. I'm not sure yet which company it was. I have not yet been able to remember that. But it's one that's quite friendly with the Americans. And it's not a terribly big base. It's a few square miles. And the buildings, it's pre-built, by the way, and the buildings are all crystal. So it's an ancient crystal city that was abandoned and they found and moved into. Yeah, that's what I believe the purpose of it was.
What does the eel civilization look like? What kind of interactions do they have with humans?
Well, the eel civilization they're basically Stone Age. It's extremely difficult. It's not impossible, but it's extremely difficult and rare for an oceanic civilization to advance past the Stone Age because, you know, it's very hard to build electronics underwater. So, and it's very hard to like forge and do metalwork underwater, so it's quite rare that they'll advance past that. But so they have little small buildings and stuff, and the eels themselves are glowing. They look pretty much like moray eels, but they glow a light blue, and instead of fins on the front, they have arms and hands that are about the same as ours, just about. It's quite uncanny to look at, but also they're really beautiful. And they're about 100 feet long, and they are extremely intelligent, and their interactions with humans are bad. The humans that they've encountered have taken them, enslaved them, experimented on them, killed off large amounts of them to clear out their territory for use by themselves. They quite understandably do not have a good view of us, so yeah.
How big was this transit station on Europa? How many people worked there, and how many ships would pass every day?
How big was it? Oh, about 10 square miles, I would say. The cavern in which the ships would land was humongous. It was probably around 5 miles wide, 2 miles high, and 20 miles long. It was megalithic. In fact, it was above megalithic. It was cyclopean, I guess would be the word for that. How many people worked there? About 2,500 permanent staff, but a lot of other people came and went. It's common for Solar Warden people who are in training to come through there and work for a few weeks or a few months or whatever. And that bumped the staff up at most times of the year to about 6,000. How many ships would pass every day? That varies. There's no easy answer to that. On average, on a typical day, probably around 100 ships, but there were really busy seasons, like for instance, if there's a huge, like a trade fair or something, we're not the only species to have trade fairs. There might be thousands that would pass in a day. We would have to call in reinforcements from other bases around the solar system, and most of them would never land, and most of these ships would never land. We would have to send shuttles up to inspect them. That happened.
How long was the workday?
I believe you were awake 28 hours and you slept for 16. And during those 16 hours, there would be other people on another shift. You know, it never, Europa never sleeps. You know, wormholes don't sleep, and people will pass through them at any hour. They don't care about the rest of us, you know. But my work day was 28 hours, and then I got 16 hours of sleep.
Percentage-wise, how many ships were human and ET?
I would say probably 85% ET, 15% human. As much as humans have advanced out there, we are still such a tiny, tiny minority that we're basically still insignificant. You know, a few trillion in a galaxy of 100 billion stars ain't shit, really. And plus there were people coming in from other galaxies as well.
Do the breakaway Germans and Japanese also pass through there and get inspected?
Yes, they do. They do. They hate it, and they're the most likely to try and smuggle something, and they are the most likely to get away with it because, you know, they can't... It's almost ceremonial, the role that Solar Warden has there. You know, they could not, in a real way, fight any of these people coming through, hardly. But most of them don't know it. But the breakaway Germans and Japanese absolutely do know it, that they would trounce Solar Warden instantly if Solar Warden tried to stop them from doing anything. So they just break all the laws and get away with it.
What were the biggest size ships that passed through there?
I remember one, it was kind of an arc ship carrying things from a planet which was nearing the end of its cycle. I think it was, the explanation given was that it was about to be swallowed by a supernova. And this arc ship was, I'd say, about 2,000 miles long, thereabouts. It's hard to even comprehend something that huge, a structure that huge existing. So that ship did not get inspected. It was actually just kind of allowed to pass through on good faith, but Adam did get to see it. It was a huge, funnily enough, it looked a lot like Osiris's solar boat. It's what it was shaped like. It was metal, or something metal-like. And the species they were more like a Spinosaurus type of thing. They were much smaller, and they were humanoid more in shape. Their body was more humanoid in shape, but they did have like the crocodile-ish heads, and they had like the sails on their backs. And they had tails. Most of them were yellow, some of them were red, some of them were brown. And who knows where they even came from, but yeah, I think that was probably the biggest one.
Did Adam ever bust a big smuggle? And if yes, what was it?
Yeah, one time he busted a really big child porn smuggling operation. Yeah, that got dark really fast. And it was by another American ship, not Solar Warden, but a different American group. I don't remember which one exactly. But yeah, he found a cargo hold full of that stuff, and that traumatized him quite a lot. And he ordered, the ship had to be let through for some reason that I can't yet remember, but what he did was he went into the cargo hold with a flamethrower and torched all of those magazines, because they were paper magazines. It wasn't like they weren't on a hard drive or anything. And he did look through the hard drives on the ship. But yeah, he did that and torched all of them and then let them through, humiliated, and yeah.
Were there ships that were never subject to any inspection?
Aldebaranite ships were not subject to inspection. And there was another, Mantid ships, the Mantid Empire, not Mars Mantids. The Mars Mantids were subject to inspection, but Mantid Empire ships were not subject to inspection.
Did Adam take bribes, and if yes, how frequently and in what form? How rampant was corruption there in general?
Yeah, he did take bribes on occasion. It was not common, but there were times he would allow ships through if they were carrying like coffee or cigars or chocolate or weed, certain controlled substances like that, that are usually contraband. The bribes he usually took were sexual favors. He was that type of dude. He never forced himself on anyone, really, although he did like to use psionic tricks to manipulate women into doing that. E.T. women, particularly. He was a xenophile. Yeah, I'm not claiming he was a great guy. Adam was not a great guy, but yeah. But it was not a frequent thing that he did. He did it occasionally, when he felt that wherever the smuggled goods were ending up would not be harmful. How rampant was corruption there in general? Extremely rampant. Everyone was corrupt. All the inspectors had their price. All the inspectors would make allowances and would let certain people pass through. I would say corruption was not just rampant, it was universal. That's kind of what happens when you have a slave population who are not getting paid, but who still need to eke out a living. They will find some other way to support themselves. And, usually crime is the only accessible way of doing that. So, yeah.
Was the colony simply called Europa?
It had another name, but I don't know what its name was yet. I have not remembered that. It was Port something. It was named after a person, but I don't know. I have not remembered yet which person or what the name was.
What was the colony like in 1969, and how did it change through the years? Can you describe the size, the population, architecture, technology, the biggest ET groups, the chimera beings, etc.?
It was very 60s in 1969. There was a lot of neon stuff. There were, the hairstyles, the music, the artwork, all that kind of stuff. And it changed through the years as new people came and went from both Earth and from other planets. It is not disconnected and stagnated in the way that, like, German and Japanese breakaway colonies are. It was modern, and it stayed modern because it was, modern military guys and girls coming and going. So the size actually remained pretty much the same. The architecture, they built new buildings occasionally. They would tear some down and build new ones, and the new ones would be progressively uglier. The original base was quite old and had been there for, I think it was one of the original ones built by the Germans when they were first leaving Earth in the late 1800s. That's kind of a whole story in and of itself, I know, but I think it was one of their original ones, judging by the architecture, but then they left it behind, because again, it was quite hard to exist there. The technology advanced very quickly. In the late 60s, their technology level was probably about 30 years ahead of us now. In 1969, they had pretty decent holographics, they had full touch screens, and they had some, like, psionic stuff, but you would have had to have, like, Neuralink implants in order to use it. So yeah, that's probably about 30 years ahead of where we are now. By 2019, when he left, it was advanced to probably, way beyond that. They had full glass pads, they had fully psionic tech that did not require any implants or anything. It was all, biotechnology based. They had stuff that was just about on par with the rest of the breakaway by 2019 when he finally left. The biggest ET groups, there were hardly any ETs actually living there permanently, unless you're counting chimeras. And the amount of chimeras grew through the years. Probably in the 60s, there were probably 10 chimeras total, up until there were a few hundred in 2019. And these were of varying types. There was a crocodile human chimera who worked in the office. There were these other chimeras who were, I think perhaps they were human, well, they were humans, but I think perhaps their DNA had been spliced with a cuttlefish or a chameleon or something, because they had very shiny scales that glowed a little bit and they would change color. They were really beautiful and really, really cool, actually. Yeah, they were a thing. Then there was a family of them. They had their colony, I think their colony had been built on like a rogue planet or something. And so they had been bioformed for it in order to like live somewhere with no sunlight. But something had happened to their colony, and so they had moved around and found themselves living on Europa for a time. And that was in probably the late 90s, I would say. And they stayed. They liked it there for whatever reason, and they stayed.
Was it strictly an American place, or was it open for travel by other groups from Earth and the Breakaway?
I answered that earlier. Everyone came through. And there were other people from Earth, from other Earth countries stationed there. Western Bloc nations, Sweden, France, Canada, Australia, South Korea, Italy, Japan, Spain, those kinds of places. I remember people coming through and being stationed there for a time. Yeah.
Were there any permanent residents and second, third generation colonists there?
Yes, there were about 500 to 700 permanent residents. It was very much mostly a military installation. The colonial element was an afterthought, but it was there. And so, yeah, there were people there, and some of them did stay for multiple generations, although not very many. It wasn't a nice place to live. It was a good place for, a fun night out while you were having your ship inspected, but it was not a good place to live, really. I don't think. But some people did live there, such as Adam's landlord, whom I will get to in a few minutes.
How frequent were the contacts with Earth?
Constant. There were always military people coming and going from Earth to Europa and vice versa. We got Earth newspapers sometimes. We got the New York Times. There were a couple of other language groups that had newspapers there, like the more prominent ones. There were Korean newspapers. I think there were Swedish newspapers and a few others that I don't exactly remember, but yeah. There was constant contact with Earth. Earth was this place that we knew everything about. We just couldn't ever go to without permission, and Adam never had permission.
What was Adam's life like there? How did he pass his time?
Boring is how I would describe his life. He had too much time to think. He had too much time to think about the fact that he had amnesia, that he didn't know anything about his life before he woke up in the tank, which made him a very angry and vindictive person. He had various ways of passing his time as the years came and went. He would write short stories. He would write, like, murder mystery short stories for a while. For a while he was into painting with acrylic paints, and he would do, like, abstract artwork mostly, but he would also do, like, kind of Warhol-esque pictures that were, like, kind of graphicized versions of photographs or of objects. Like I said, kind of Warhol-esque. He was also a major alcoholic. A major alcoholic, which was common in that time and place. So, yeah, that was pretty much how he passed his time. He had a few friends. He was friends with his landlord, which I guess I'll get into in the next question.
Tell us about his landlady. Did she sublet or own the place?
Well, it was a landlord, actually. And his landlord was a 12-foot-tall, fire-red ant-man. I don't know where that species comes from, but yeah, he sublet the place, and he was actually very friendly to Adam and in general. I actually know another guy who knew him pretty well, which is interesting, but so, yeah, he sublet it. He did not own it. The place was owned by the U.S. Navy, or by the United Nations, I guess.
Did Adam ever get vacations and go anywhere else?
He got a few vacations in his life, very few, but he went a couple of places. He went to Ganymede, not to the Solar Warden place on Ganymede. He went to a proper colony on Ganymede, which has really great nightlife and some very interesting museums where they do, like, anti-gravity art displays. And you actually get to go in and, like, float among the exhibits and stuff. It's pretty cool. And he went to, I mentioned in another show, I believe, so I won't go into it too much, but he went to the amusement park platform floating in the lower orbit of Neptune. Yeah, he went there a couple of times, and he didn't really do much there. He just kind of It was just kind of where people talked about, so he just kind of went and he ate and drank and got laid. He didn't do much of the actually fun stuff. Very unlike me, frankly.
So did they take this alter Adam for a specific reason, or they just needed to fill in positions?
They did need to fill in positions, but they also needed him out of Camp Hero because he was an alter of Alex who manifested himself. And they didn't want Alex having an alter to fall back on, for one thing, and for another thing, he was like resisting and being quite obstinate, and so they were like, okay, we need to get this guy out of here. And so when the Solar Warden people came through looking for positions to fill, they just put him on the list, wiped his mind completely, and sent him off with the little consciousness piece that contains Adam contained in a little magnetic and crystal bottle that somehow contains a soul piece. This is technology that is beyond my capacity to explain. You know, this is not human technology, this is ET technology, and it is something I am not able to really comprehend, but I just have seen it, so I know that that's how it works. So that's how and why he got taken.
Did he and others like him ever think about escaping, or at least transferring? Were they kept in line directly by force, or was it more subtle?
I don't remember him ever thinking about that. And are they kept in line directly by force, or is it more subtle? I believe it's by the thing that Penny and some others have described, which is where there's a chip in the brain, and if you start thinking about escaping or transferring or whatever, you start getting a crushing headache, and V2K thoughts of other things projected in. So, if he ever did think about anything, it was only for a few seconds, and his colleagues would have all had the same thing.
What happened after his tour was over? How did he find out that he was an alter of yours?
Well, he was never told it was over. He was called into his office for a routine... He was called into his CO's office for a routine thing, and someone walked up behind him and shot him in the brainstem, and that was that. He never saw it coming, he never had any reason to suspect that his tour was over, nothing, it just was over, and they just ended it quite quickly. How did I find out he was an alter of mine? Because he reintegrated himself. He showed up in my head, causing trouble, and trying to take over, and forcibly reintegrated himself, which is basically mind rape, in my estimation, but that's what wound up happening. So there's not any alternate explanation for what he is besides an alter of mine. He could not possibly be anything else.
When did Solar Warden start operating on Europa?
Well, before they were called Solar Warden, because they weren't called Solar Warden until 1982 or 83. So they started during the Project Mayflower era in, I believe, about the 1920s. Approximately, that was what I remember being told.
Several questions about the chimeras. Was the company that created them from Earth, or the breakaway? What is the difference between a chimera and a hybrid? What was the purpose of their creation? And how well did they fit in? How prevalent are chimeras in the places you remember? Can you name a few other examples of chimeras?
They weren't created by a company. They were created by the military in actual military laboratories. But I don't know which base, to be quite honest. What is the difference between a chimera and a hybrid? First of all, chimeras they don't pass at all. They are very clearly human-animal hybrids, or a human-animal mix, or a human-alien mix. And second of all, a hybrid is usually with something that you could also breed with. An alien you could breed with, which is a lot of aliens. A lot of aliens can breed with Solarian humans, but, you know, we can't breed with animals. Okay, what was the purpose of their creation, and how well did they fit in? The purpose of their creation was in bioforming, in order to make a group of people more suitable for living on a planet, usually. That's the usual purpose. How well did they fit in? Not well at all. They were discriminated against horribly. They were not treated well at all in general. People would, I remember people, throwing food at them and stuff, and, making disparaging remarks. based on whatever species these people had been spliced with. They did not get on well at all. How prevalent are chimeras in the places you remember? Not very. They were a fad that died out fairly quickly. They started in the early 50s, and they were completely out of fashion by the mid to late 50s at the latest, because they realized there are better ways at bioforming, and that there are good for your colonists to not be people who other people are prone to throwing food at, you know. Can you name a few other examples of chimeras? Well, I've mentioned the ones who were, I believe, spliced with cuttlefish, who could, like, change their colors at will. I can remember a bug chimera guy. I think he was spliced with an ant, and he had kind of an ant-like head, and he had the mouth that opens sideways and stuff, and he had to use a custom-made voice box so that he could even speak. I remember a dolphin chimera, interestingly, but she lived on land, so I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of making her was. Maybe she was someone's fetish, I don't know. But those are ones that stick out in my mind. And of course there was a secretary woman there who was a crocodile human chimera. She looked very crocodile-like, but she had a humanoid body, and she had hair on her head. Okay, there's also Ganymede, another moon of Jupiter. It's basically the playground of the ultra-wealthy within the solar system, or one of them, of course. The ultra-wealthy American playground, I should say, not Germans. The German ultra-wealthy tend to hang out on Titan and Ceres. Ganymede also is home to Kruger headquarters, and right next to it, or right above it, a level above it, is the Kruger family's biggest estate, which is about the size of Manhattan, so several square miles. I've been there a couple of times. I was there in 2020 for Gabriel Kruger's funeral, which was extremely well attended. No one mourned him, though, not even his wife or children. He is not missed in the slightest, but everyone showed up for his funeral because, you know, to see and be seen, I guess. There's also another colony on Ganymede that is down at the bottom of the ocean, and I remember it as a terrifying experience being there, because there's the ice crust of Ganymede, which is a number of miles deep, and no light penetrates it, and then going further down, there is the ocean, which is many, many miles deep, and no light penetrates it. So down at the bottom, there's this colony, right, and it's underneath a glass dome, or not glass, some translucent material that is indestructible. And because literally no light gets down there, you're in a city that is just seemingly just suspended in a black void. It is horrifying. I guess the people who live down there or are born down there are used to it, and in fact, probably a lot of them have like a phobia of sunlight, I would imagine, but for the rest of us who are used to it, it is horrendous.
Can you briefly say what Kruger does, for those who don't know? Do they have any political affiliations, or do they just work with everybody?
Well, Kruger has many, many branches of itself that do various things, but primarily they are a mercenary company, and their role is, well, mercenary services. Their assets are very, like Barrett from Final Fantasy VII. Cyborgs, basically, where they will take away body parts and replace them with robotic body parts. Like, they'll take off someone's forearm and replace it with a Gatling gun, or they'll replace your eyes with cameras that, like, can do thermal vision and scan things and, you know, all sorts of stuff. And it's painful. Their systems are painful to the user. With how they treat their employees and everything, it's kind of a miracle that they stay in business, that there hasn't been, like, mass mutinies, like, every other week forcing them out of business, but somehow they maintain it all. Politically, the family is a Nazi family. The Kruger family is a Nazi family politically, but as a company, no, they don't have any actual loyalties.
What happened to Gabriel Kruger that he couldn't be revived?
Who knows? In order for him to not be revivable, he would have had to have had both his frontal lobe and his brainstem irreparably destroyed. No one else has ever really fully said this, but the brainstem is where your soul is stored. So if your brainstem is destroyed, then your soul goes off and finds somewhere else to be, and it can't really be retrieved once it's gone to reincarnate fully. So that's what happened to him.
Who's everybody that showed up at his funeral?
The elites of the breakaway. The Emmermans, all four of the big four Japanese breakaway families, which includes the Arasakas as well as the Daishinos, the Takayamas, and the Fujimoris, as well as the Fernandez family of Fernandez Arms, and a number of politicians from Earth even showed up. The Clintons, Angela Merkel. There's a congressman in America, his name is Matt Gaetz. He is kind of a big deal in the breakaway also, and so he showed up. That's where I get my memory of him being in the breakaway, is from this.
Who lives in the colony at the bottom of the ocean on Ganymede? What's the purpose of that place?
That place is a Kruger company town, pretty much exclusively. They farm out assets. There's like a pretty sizable farm of like babies in artificial wombs who, once they reach a certain age, will get shipped into Kruger, and the people who live there are primarily assets and executives and their families. So that's pretty much the purpose of that particular colony. There's also Io, which is it's where the overflow from Europa goes to a lot of the time. I remember being there, I remember Adam being there several times, again taking in overflow. There is a bar there also called the Glass Hub. It's part of a chain. The original is on Mars. There is one on Io. There is one, and there's a few outside the solar system. It's more of the working class vacation spot, fun spot. And I remember hanging out there a lot. I was pretty drunk, so I don't remember it that clearly. But it happened. There's also the fourth moon of Jupiter, Callisto, which is, I know there's a lot of Germans living there. I don't know that much about it, although other than that, it is also a major spot for black goo mining. Massive spot. There are huge deposits of it there. It's probably the biggest spot that Schwarzsonne or the Black Sun Society gets their supply.
So places like Europa, Io, Callisto, etc. are shared by the Americans and the breakaway Germans? Does it mean that the World War II in space that the Solar Warden is supposedly waging is not real?
No. They are on these moons at the same time. However, they're not sharing bases by any stretch, and they fight over territory on these moons all the time. They're not sharing territory. They're just on the same bodies, which is necessary sometimes because, first of all, the strategic opportunities of being anywhere in Sol just about is too good to pass up, and second of all, in the galaxy, every square centimeter of the galaxy is owned by someone. So, you have to take what you can get. But World War II in space is still very much happening.
Are there submarine tours under the oceans of Europa and Callisto, and ship tours around Jupiter? And if yes, what are they like?
There are submarine tours under the oceans of Europa, definitely. There's some ruins underneath there from some civilization, and they are under a force field that no one has ever been able to actually get through, which is kind of insane to imagine, but yeah. And they take you around to see, the megalithic wildlife and all of that. And Callisto, I don't know about if there's any on Callisto, probably. And ship tours around Jupiter, yeah, there are. I've never been on one, so I can't honestly tell you what a ship tour around Jupiter is like. I just know that they exist because I remember seeing posters and TV commercials for them. But I don't have any memory to date of actually going on one.
And lastly, I think I'm speaking for all the Terran people when I say we need less bad aliens coming into the system through that hole in Jupiter. So now that the responsible folks are back in the White House, do you think we'll finally put up a wall over the hole?
No, there will never be a wall put over the hole, sorry. No president will ever be allowed to disrupt galactic trade. You know, we don't live on an island in the galaxy, we live in the galaxy. Much like how I, as an American, recognize that I don't live in an island of a country, I live in a country on a planet, unlike 70% of Americans now. But yeah, that's a rant for another day.